The Hampton estate sprawled across 20 acres of manicured lawns that rolled gently toward the Atlantic Ocean. White tents billowed in the summer breeze, their silk panels catching the afternoon light like sails on a tranquil sea. The wedding, of Natalie Sterling to Christopher Hammond, had transformed the historic property into something from a fairy tale, with thousands of white roses climbing up marble columns and crystal installations that threw rainbows across the grass. Guests arrived in luxury cars, stepping out in designer gowns and tailored suits, their jewelry glinting as they made their way toward the ceremony space where a string orchestra played soft melodies that drifted on the wind. Victoria Hayes stood, near the edge of the property, watching the procession of elegance with a practiced smile fixed on her face. She wore a simple sage green dress that she had sewn herself, elegant in its understated design but modest compared to the couture surrounding her. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun, and her only jewelry was a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. She clutched a small clutch purse and tried to blend into the background, which had become her specialty at family gatherings. Natalie was her cousin, though you would never guess it from their lives. Where Natalie had glided through private schools and society events, Victoria had worked her way through design school while juggling 3 jobs. Where Natalie commanded attention the moment she entered a room, Victoria had learned to become invisible, watching from the sidelines as others claimed the spotlight. It was not bitterness that Victoria felt, not exactly. It was resignation, the quiet acceptance that some people were born to shine, while others were meant to observe. The ceremony took place on a cliff overlooking the ocean, with the bride and groom exchanging vows as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Natalie looked radiant in a gown that probably cost more than Victoria's annual rent, her veil trailing behind her like a river of silk. The guests sighed and applauded at all the right moments, and Victoria clapped along with them, her hands coming together in mechanical rhythm. When the officiant pronounced them married, champagne corks popped, and the crowd erupted in celebration. Victoria remained at the back of the gathering, unnoticed. The reception was held in the largest tent, where tables draped in cream linen surrounded a dance floor of polished wood. Crystal chandeliers hung from the tent ceiling, and each centerpiece was a towering arrangement of orchids and roses. Victoria found her assigned seat at table 17, positioned near the entrance where servers rushed in and out with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The other seats at her table were occupied by distant relatives she barely knew, people who exchanged polite nods before turning to more interesting conversations with others. Victoria sat quietly, sipping her champagne and watching the celebration unfold before her. On the main floor, Natalie danced with her new husband, their movements graceful and practiced. Friends surrounded them, laughing and taking photographs, creating memories that would fill albums and social media feeds for months to come. Victoria recognized many of the guests from previous family events, successful lawyers and doctors, entrepreneurs and socialites, people whose lives seemed charmed and effortless. She thought about her own small studio in Boston, the cramped space where she drafted designs and met with clients who could barely afford her modest fees. She loved her work, but moments like these made her wonder if she had chosen the harder path. A waiter approached with a tray of past appetizers, and Victoria accepted a small plate. She was considering whether it would be too obvious to leave early when a shift occurred in the atmosphere of the room. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned, and a ripple of awareness moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Victoria looked up from her plate, curious about what had captured everyone's attention. A man had entered the tent, and his presence commanded immediate notice. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his black suit with effortless authority. His hair was dark, styled with careful precision, and his features were sharp and angular, the kind of face that photographers would call striking rather than handsome. But it was his eyes that held Victoria's attention when his gaze swept across the room. They were a deep blue, intense and calculating, the eyes of someone who missed nothing and revealed little. He moved through the crowd with measured steps, acknowledging greetings with slight nods but never stopping to engage in conversation. People whispered as he passed, their voices carrying fragments of information. Julian Westbrook, tech billionaire, Westbrook Technologies, youngest CEO to break into the Fortune 100, reclusive, powerful, dangerous, some said, though Victoria was not sure what that meant in the context of business and society events. She watched him with detached curiosity, the way one might observe a rare bird that had unexpectedly appeared in a common garden. He would find his table among the important guests near the front, she assumed, and that would be the last she would see of him. She returned her attention to her plate, spearing, a piece of seared tuna with her fork. The chair beside her scraped against the floor. Victoria looked up, startled, and found herself staring directly into those intense blue eyes. Julian Westbrook had somehow crossed the entire tent and now stood beside her forgotten table at the back of the room. Without asking permission or offering explanation, he pulled out the empty chair and sat down with the kind of calm authority that suggested he belonged wherever he chose to be. Victoria's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Around them, conversations died completely as every eye in the tent turned to watch this unexpected development. She felt heat rush to her cheeks, aware of the sudden scrutiny. Julian seemed entirely unbothered by the attention. He adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate precision, then turned to face her fully. His voice was low when he spoke, meant only for her ears despite the dozens of people now openly staring. "I need you to do something for me." Victoria blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me?" she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian leaned slightly closer, his expression serious and focused entirely on her. "Pretend you know me. Act as though we came here together." Victoria's mind raced through a dozen responses, each more confused than the last. "I don't understand. Who are you? Why would I—" He cut her off with a slight gesture, his eyes flicking, briefly toward a group of guests near the bar who were watching with undisguised interest. "Those people believe they have some claim on my time, my attention, my decisions. If they think I'm attached, they will leave me alone. You would be doing me a considerable favor." The audacity of the request left Victoria speechless. Here was a man she had never met, asking her to participate in some kind of elaborate deception at her own cousin's wedding. It was absurd. It was inappropriate. And yet, as she looked around the tent at all the faces now focused on her, at the whispers spreading like wildfire, she felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in her life, she was not invisible. For the first time at a family event, she was the center of attention. Julian must have sensed her hesitation, because he added quietly, "I will make it worth your while. Name your price." Victoria met his gaze, searching for signs of manipulation or mockery, but found only steady certainty. This man was used to getting what he wanted, she realized. He had calculated this approach, chosen her specifically for reasons she did not yet understand. She should refuse. She should stand up and walk away from this bizarre situation. Instead, she heard herself say, "I don't want money." His eyebrow lifted slightly, genuine interest flickering in those blue eyes. "Then what do you want?" Victoria thought about her small studio, her struggling business, the constant feeling of being overlooked and underestimated. She thought about Natalie dancing in the spotlight while she sat in the shadows. And then she made a decision that would change everything. "Introduce me to your world," she said firmly. "Your contacts, your network. Help me build something real." Julian studied her for a long moment, and Victoria had the distinct impression she was being assessed in ways she could not fully comprehend. Then, slowly, He extended his hand across the small table. "Deal." Victoria placed her hand in his, and his grip was warm and firm. Around them, the whispers grew louder, speculation building with each passing second. Julian stood, pulling her gently to her feet with him. And suddenly she was standing beside one of the most powerful men in the country, while hundreds of eyes watched. He offered her his arm with old-fashioned formality, and Victoria took it, her fingers resting lightly on his sleeve. Together they walked toward the dance floor, leaving behind her table of strangers and stepping into a spotlight she had never imagined would find her. The orchestra began a new song, something slow and elegant, and Julian guided her onto the polished floor with the confidence of someone who had attended 1,000 events just like this one. As they began to move together, Victoria felt the weight of every gaze in the tent, but for once, it did not make her want to disappear. For once she felt seen. The flight back to Boston felt surreal. Victoria stared out the airplane window at the clouds drifting past, replaying the events of the wedding in her mind, like scenes from a movie she had accidentally wandered into. After that first dance, Julian had stayed by her side for the remainder of the evening, playing the role of attentive companion with convincing ease. They had spoken little, but his presence alone had been enough to transform her from invisible guest to the subject of endless speculation. By the time she finally left the reception, her phone was buzzing with messages from relatives she had not heard from in years, all suddenly interested in her life and this mysterious man who had appeared at her side. Monday morning arrived with the harsh reality of bills and deadlines. Victoria unlocked the door to her studio, a converted warehouse space in a slightly run-down neighborhood where rent was affordable and natural light was abundant. The studio was small, maybe 800 square feet, with exposed brick walls and industrial windows that looked out onto a street lined with similar buildings. Her drafting table dominated one corner, covered in sketches and fabric samples. A worn leather couch sat against the opposite wall, and a small desk held her laptop and an ever-growing stack of invoices that needed attention. It was not glamorous, but it was hers, built from nothing through years of sacrifice and determination. She made coffee in the tiny kitchenette and settled at her drafting table, trying to focus on a residential project that was due by the end of the week. Her client, a young couple expecting their first child, had a limited budget and even more limited space. Victoria had spent hours working on designs that would maximize functionality without sacrificing style, but this morning her mind kept drifting back to the Hampton estate, to crystal chandeliers and ocean views, to the feeling of expensive fabric beneath her fingers as she danced with a man who commanded rooms without saying a word. She shook her head, annoyed with herself. That world was not hers, and Julian Westbrook was a stranger who had used her for his own purposes. Whatever brief connection they had shared was finished, a single evening that would fade into memory. She picked up her pencil and returned to the floor plan in front of her, determined to forget about weddings and billionaires and pretend relationships. The knock on her studio door came just before noon. Victoria assumed it was the delivery driver with the fabric samples she had ordered, and called out for them to enter. The door swung open and Julian Westbrook stepped inside her modest workspace, as though he had been there 100 times before. Victoria nearly dropped her coffee mug. She stood quickly, suddenly aware of how different this space was from anywhere he likely spent his time. The studio felt even smaller with him in it, his presence somehow filling every corner. He wore dark jeans and a gray sweater today, more casual than the wedding suit, but no less commanding. His blue eyes swept across the room, taking in the sketches pinned to the walls, the fabric swatches, the organized chaos of a working designer's space. "How did you find me?" Victoria asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Julian closed the door behind him with quiet precision. "I make it my business to know things. Your studio is not exactly hidden." He walked toward her drafting table, studying the floor plan she had been working on with genuine interest. Small space, efficient use of corners. You have talent. Victoria folded her arms across her chest, defensive. Thank you for the compliment, but you still have not explained what you are doing here. We had an arrangement for one evening. It ended when the wedding ended. Julian turned to face her fully, and she was struck again by the intensity of his focus when he looked at someone. It was as though nothing else in the world existed except the person in front of him. I want to continue the arrangement, he said simply. Victoria laughed, the sound more incredulous than amused. You cannot be serious. That was one night, a performance for a room full of strangers. I have a life here, work that matters to me. I cannot just drop everything to play pretend girlfriend for a tech billionaire. Julian moved closer, his hands sliding into his pockets in a gesture that somehow made him appear both relaxed and alert. I am not asking you to drop anything. I am proposing a partnership that would benefit both of us. Victoria stepped back, needing space to think clearly. What kind of partnership? Julian gestured toward her desk, where unpaid invoices formed, an accusatory pile. Your business is struggling. You are talented, but you cannot reach the clients who would truly appreciate your work because you do not have access to their world. I can provide that access. He paused, letting the words settle. In return, you accompany me to select events where appearances matter. Business dinners, charity galas, functions where my presence is required but my personal life becomes a distraction. Victoria felt her heart rate quicken, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. So, I would be what exactly? A prop to make you look unavailable? Something flickered in Julian's eyes, almost like amusement, but it vanished too quickly. To be certain, you would be a partner, someone intelligent enough to hold conversations with business leaders and creative enough to be interesting, someone who will not sell stories to tabloids or expect more than what we agree upon. She wanted to refuse immediately, to send him back to whatever tower he lived in and return to her simple, struggling, honest life. But her eyes drifted to those invoices, to the bills that kept piling up despite her best efforts. She thought about the couple waiting for her designs, about the dozens of other clients she could help if only she had the resources and connections to reach them. She thought about spending the rest of her life feeling invisible while others claimed the opportunities she could only dream about. If I agreed, and I am not saying I am, what would the terms be? Victoria asked carefully. Julian pulled out his phone and opened a document, handing it to her. 6 months. You accompany me to approximately 2 events per month. In exchange, I introduce you to my network and provide recommendations to anyone seeking design services. You maintain complete control over your business and your schedule. Either party can end the arrangement at any time with 2 weeks' notice. Victoria read through the document, surprised by how fair and straightforward it was. There were clear boundaries about expectations, compensation for her time, and protections for both parties. It read less like a personal arrangement and more like a professional contract, which somehow made it feel more legitimate and more strange at the same time. This is insane, she said quietly, though her resolve was weakening. Julian took his phone back, his expression unreadable. Perhaps, but it is also an opportunity that will not come again. I do not make offers like this lightly. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. Think about it. You have until Friday to decide. If I do not hear from you, I will assume your answer is no. He left as quickly as he had arrived, the door clicking shut behind him with finality. Victoria stood in the sudden silence of her studio, the coffee in her mug now cold, her mind spinning with possibilities and warnings. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was a terrible idea, that mixing her professional life with this kind of arrangement could only end in disaster. But another part, the part that had felt seen and valued for the first time at that wedding, whispered that maybe some opportunities were worth the risk. She sat down heavily on her couch, staring at the door through which Julian had disappeared. She had 3 days to make a decision that could change everything. 3 days to choose between safety and possibility, between remaining invisible and stepping into the light. Victoria pulled out her phone and opened her contacts, her thumb hovering over the number Julian had left in his document. Not yet, she told herself. First, she needed to think, to weigh every consequence, to make a choice with clear eyes and steady hands. But even as she set the phone aside and returned to her drafting table, she knew in her heart that the decision had already been made. Victoria sent the email on Thursday evening, 2 simple words that felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing how far the fall would be. I accept. Julian's response came within minutes, professional and efficient, with details for their first event, a technology summit gala at the Mandarin Oriental on Saturday night. A car would collect her at 7. Dress code was black tie. He would handle everything else. The days that followed moved with dizzying speed. A stylist arrived at her studio Friday afternoon with 3 garment bags containing gowns that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Victoria chose a deep emerald dress that hugged her figure before flowing into a graceful skirt, elegant without being ostentatious. Shoes and jewelry arrived separately, along with a note in Julian's precise handwriting, "Wear what makes you comfortable. Confidence matters more than labels." Saturday arrived with autumn rain pattering against her windows. Victoria spent the afternoon preparing, trying to calm the nervousness that fluttered in her chest like trapped birds. She reminded herself, this was business, a professional arrangement that would open doors for her career. The fact that her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the diamond earrings had nothing to do with seeing Julian again and everything to do with stepping into an unfamiliar world. The car arrived precisely at 7, a sleek black sedan with a driver who opened her door with practiced courtesy. Victoria slid into the back seat and found Julian already waiting, his presence filling the space even in the dim interior light. He wore a tailored tuxedo that emphasized his broad shoulders, his dark hair styled perfectly, but it was his expression when he looked at her that made her breath catch. For just a moment, something unguarded flickered in those blue eyes before his controlled mask returned. "You look exceptional," he said quietly. Victoria smoothed her skirt, buying herself a moment to compose her response. "The dress helps. Thank you for arranging everything." Julian's lips curved into the slightest smile. "The dress is just fabric. You make it exceptional." The compliment settled between them as the car merged into Boston traffic, heading toward the hotel where the gala would unfold. Julian briefed her on the evening ahead, naming key figures she would meet, explaining the politics and alliances that governed his world. Victoria listened carefully, committing names and details to memory, aware that tonight would test whether she truly belonged in this arrangement. The Mandarin Oriental's ballroom had been transformed into something from a technology fantasy, with holographic displays floating above tables and interactive screens embedded in the walls. Guests mingled beneath chandeliers that shifted colors in programmed sequences, their conversations punctuated by the gentle music of a jazz quartet. Julian guided Victoria through the crowd with his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture that appeared casual, but somehow made every nerve in her body aware of his proximity. They were stopped every few steps by executives and entrepreneurs eager to speak with Julian, to pitch ideas or secure meetings, or simply bask in his attention. Victoria watched him navigate these interactions with surgical precision, giving each person exactly enough time and interest to be polite without committing to anything substantial. And then, to her surprise, he would turn to her and include her in the conversation, asking her opinion on design elements or creative approaches, treating her input as valuable rather than decorative. Victoria is an interior designer, Julian told a venture capitalist who was describing his new office space. She has thoughts on maximizing creativity in workplace environments. The man turned to her with genuine curiosity, and Victoria found herself discussing the psychology of space and color theory while Julian listened with what appeared to be authentic interest. When the conversation ended, the venture capitalist handed her his business card and asked her to send him a proposal. The evening continued in this pattern. Julian would introduce her, create openings for her expertise, and then step back to let her shine. By the time dinner was served, Victoria had collected 6 business cards and 3 requests for consultations. She should have felt triumphant, but instead she felt confused. This was supposed to be a performance, yet Julian seemed genuinely invested in helping her succeed. After dinner, they stepped onto the hotel's terrace for air. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and glittering below them. Victoria stood at the railing, breathing in the cool night air, aware of Julian standing close beside her. The sounds of the gala filtered through the glass doors, but out here it was quiet enough to think. "Thank you," Victoria said softly, "for tonight, for introducing me properly, not just as decoration." Julian turned to face her, his expression thoughtful in the dim light. "I told you this was a partnership. I do not waste time with people who cannot hold their own." He paused, and something shifted in his voice. "Besides, watching you work a room is far more interesting than most conversations I endure at these events." Victoria looked up at him, seeing something in his face that had not been there before. Vulnerability, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion from maintaining his carefully constructed walls. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. "The performance, the constant calculation, never letting anyone see who you really are?" Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought she had overstepped. Then he surprised her by answering honestly. "Every day. But showing weakness in my world is the same as surrender. People are always watching, waiting for an opportunity to exploit any crack in the armor." He met her eyes. "That is why I needed someone I could trust. Someone who had nothing to gain by destroying me." The confession hung between them, raw and unexpected. Victoria realized that what she had interpreted as manipulation was actually desperation. A powerful man seeking one small space where he could drop his guard. And somehow, impossibly, he had chosen her. "I would not destroy you," she said quietly. Julian's hand reached out, his fingers brushing against hers on the railing. The touch was light, tentative, so different from his usual confidence. "I know. I saw it at the wedding, the way you observed without judgment, the strength in your stillness. I knew you would understand." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. This was not supposed to happen. They had a contract, clear boundaries, a professional arrangement with defined limits. But standing on that terrace with the city lights below and Julian's eyes searching hers, none of those carefully constructed barriers seemed to matter. The weeks that followed became a blur of events and stolen moments. They attended 3 more galas, a business dinner in New York, and a weekend technology conference in San Francisco. With each event, the performance became harder to distinguish from reality. Julian's hand would find hers under dinner tables, his eyes would seek her out across crowded rooms, and the conversations between them deepened beyond small talk into territories that felt dangerously intimate. Victoria's business flourished. The connections Julian provided led to consultations with tech executives and startup founders, clients who appreciated her vision and paid her properly for her work. She hired an assistant, moved into a larger studio, and saw her designs featured in a local magazine. Everything she had worked toward was finally within reach. Yet she found herself thinking less about the professional opportunities and more about the moments when Julian would drop his mask and let her see the man beneath the billionaire facade. One evening, Julian invited her to his penthouse to discuss design ideas for his living space. The apartment occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower overlooking Boston Harbor, all clean lines and expensive furniture that felt more like a showroom than a home. Victoria walked through the space, seeing immediately what was missing. "It is beautiful," she said carefully, "but it does not feel like anyone lives here. It feels like a hotel." Julian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his hands in his pockets, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "That is because I do not really live anywhere. I exist in offices and conference rooms and anonymous hotel suites. This is just another place to sleep between obligations." The loneliness in his voice pierced something in Victoria's chest. She walked to stand beside him, looking out at the city below. "That sounds exhausting." He turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. "It was until you." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with heartbreaking tenderness. "This was supposed to be simple. A business arrangement, nothing more. But every time I am with you, the pretending becomes harder because it stops feeling like pretending at all." Victoria's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and fast beneath her palms. "Julian, we have a contract. Boundaries. We agreed." He cut her off gently. "I know what we agreed. I know what logic dictates. But I am asking you to forget the contract for one moment and tell me the truth. Is this still just business for you?" Victoria looked up into those blue eyes that had haunted her thoughts for weeks, and she knew she could not lie. Not to him, and not to herself. "No," she whispered. "It stopped being business the first night, I think. I just did not want to admit it." Julian's other hand slid around her waist, pulling her closer until barely any space remained between them. "Then we have a problem. Because every rule I made to protect myself is crumbling, and I find I do not care anymore." His forehead touched hers, his breath warm against her lips. "You terrify me, Victoria Hayes." She smiled despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You terrify me too." And then he was kissing her, and Victoria stopped thinking about contracts and boundaries and all the reasons this was complicated. She kissed him back with 6 weeks of suppressed longing, feeling him respond with equal intensity, and knew that, whatever happened next, there was no going back to pretending.